Middle-earth is more than just land. It is the memory of ancient heroes and terrors that awoke with the first light of dawn. Today, an old wizard will tell you. Yet another legend, so you may understand that even the darkest times can give birth to light in the north, where the wind drifts low and slow over hills cloaked in heather and fog. There lies a country that few now speak of by name. Once it was a realm of kings, tall men with star-browed crowns and memories as long as the rivers that lace their lands. This was Arnor, the northern kingdom of the Dunedain, kin to Gondor, yet fallen long before its sister in the south ever trembled, where palaces once rose of white stone, now only root-choked foundations remain, and where kings once trod in halls of carved marble, only the hoarse cry of crows echo the world. Has turned many times since the banners of Arnor last caught the sun. Even the elves, long watchers of the world's slow decline, seldom speak of it now, save in riddled verse or a dreamlike sigh. But stories like seeds lie dormant in the soil of time, and when stirred by breath or footfall, they may yet rise. It began, as these tales often do, not with a clamor of horns or a flash of blades, but with silence, a parchment, a memory unburied. Sarah Lawmaster of the fading west sat in the echoing library of Mythland. The gray havens, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of dried ink candlelight flickered over scrolls that had not been touched in 100 years. Perhaps more. His hands trembled, not with age, though he was old even by elven reckoning, but with a sense of peril long slumbering before him lay a map, not drawn by hand, but traced in a light like starlight, trapped in paper. It showed the land of Arnor, but not as it is now, torn and tangled by time. No, this was Arnor as it had been, green and proud, the cities of Anamenos and Fornos glistening like twin jewels. But what drew Kaidarn's gaze most was a mark in the hills west of Lake Haven, a symbol not seen in centuries, a star wreathed in flame beneath it, written in tenure so faint it seemed more dream than word, was a single name: Elend's son of Isildur Kirinil. Whispered the name, carried the weight of a forgotten crown. He had died long ago, slain beside his father in the disaster of the Gladden fields. His tomb, it was said, lay in the crypts of Fernost, sealed forever. But if this map spoke true, it had not remained there, and so the silence cracked. He sent for a ranger, not just any wanderer of the wilds, but one he had watched from afar, a man whose blood ran close to kings, though he bore it like a burden rather than a right. His name was Calamir, and he came as summoned. Wordless and weary, his eyes were gray like a storm over the sea, and his voice carried the weight of cold nights and lonely watch fires. Kyanal did not greet him with ceremony. He merely unrolled the map and spoke. Tell me what you know of the tomb of Eleanor Kalma. Frowned, it lies in Fernost beneath the hall of the kings. Lost to time and ruin, so says the common tale. Said Yai murmured, but legends true. Legends do not vanish. They are hidden, disguised, awaiting the hour when they must be found again. Calamir said nothing, but his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword tightened. The tomb has vanished, Kaedin continued, voice low. And not alone, 3 others of the royal line are missing, tombs long thought. Sealed, no sign of plunder, no tracks of orc or thief, only the hollow silence where memory should rest. Then who this, said the lawmaster, is the mystery. And thus began the journey Calamire rode, east beneath the shivering stars past. The hills of Ian Yule, through lands that once hummed with song, but now slept. In thistle and thorn he passed crumbling towers where moss hung like old banners, and the stones whispered of grief. At every ruin he paused, at each barrow he. Listen, the world of Arnor was not empty shadows clung to its bones, and the wind carried voices that had no mouths. The dead did not lie easy in that land. He came at last to the Barrow Downs, and though they were far south of where his path ought to lead, something drew him there, a pool older than memory. The hills were quiet too. He lit no fire that night, for the stars gave no comfort in his dreams. He saw face, pale, noble, sorrowful, crowned with twilight, and rimmed in silver. Ilinder, the name, whispered through his sleep like a breath on glass. He awoke before dawn to find a figure standing on the ridge, cloaked in gray. It was not a white, it did not shimmer with malice or hunger. It simply stood, waiting. Calamire rose hand at his sword, but did not draw. You do not belong here, he said quietly, nor do the dead, replied. The figure had stepped forward, and by the light of a waking sun Calamire saw a woman tall, wrapped in a scholar's cloak, with hair the color of shadowed bronze, and eyes sharp with thought. I am Sarah of Gundor, she said, scribe and seeker. You are hunting the tombs of Arnor. So am I. Calamire hesitated. How did you find me? I followed the same whisper you did, the one that speaks in dreams and broken stone. He studied her for a moment. She bore no weapons, only scrolls and a satchel of ink-stained tools, but there was fire in her gaze and steel in her voice. Together they turned toward the north, unseen. Behind them a wind stirred among the barrows, and something old awoke. The road north from the Barrow Downs to the ruins of Fernast was little more than a ghost trail, a suggestion rather than a path. The land had grown wild over the centuries, and though maps still bore the names, the forest had begun to reclaim what was once the realm of men. Trees rose where avenues had once unfurled in flagstone, and roots cracked the bones of roads worn smooth by royal boots. Long dead Calamire and Sarah rode in silence there, breaths fogging in the chill air, the muffled sound of hooves lost beneath the hush of moss and leaves. They had been traveling for 4 days before the towers of Fernast came into view, if towers they could still be called. Once the northern seat of kings, Fornostrain had risen, proud upon the western edge of the North Downs, its walls tall and defiant against the threats that had crept in from Almar in darker times. Now it was a broken silhouette. Jagged remnants of walls stood like teeth against the sky, and the central keep, once crowned with a dome of silvered stone, had collapsed inward like the skull of a fallen giant. But despite the ruins, something about the place still held a breath of majesty. Like a song hummed from behind a veil, Sarah, dismounting, stood silently for a long time, her fingers trailing along a fallen column etched with faded runes. The weight of memory here is heavier than stone, she murmured. Calamire nodded. He had been here once before, years ago, as a younger man. Then the place had felt empty, silent, and cold. Now it felt full, but not with the living. Be wary of the wind in these ruins, he said. It carries voices. As they descended into the heart of the ruin, the hush deepened. Sarah had brought with her a scroll bearing a partial layout of the royal crypts below. for Nas copied from fragments found in Gundor's Hall of Law. It was incomplete, worn by time, and poor handling, but it gave them something to follow. They made their way through the shattered remnants of the great hall, past shattered statues of kings whose names had long since faded from memory. And down into the vault beneath there, in the deep dark, they found the tombstone doors carved with the sigils of old stars and trees and crowns worn. Smooth by the passage of years, dust clung to every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of long sealed places. Calamir lit a lantern, and its amber glow spread cautiously into the dark, revealing crypts lined like silent sentinels. Each bore a name. Malbed arrived. Tarander, but where Ellender's should have stood, there was nothing, only a blank wall, smooth and untouched. Sarah traced her fingers over the stone, her brow furrowed. "There is no sign it was ever here," she said softly, "and yet every every tale places him here. Perhaps the records lie," Calamir said. Sarah shook her head. "Not all of them. I found a letter, an old one sealed with the emblem of Gilgalad." It spoke of Elinder's burial with reverence, and of the guardians who watched over his sleep. He was not entombed in obscurity. They searched the chamber further, and as the hours passed, the lantern light flickered, lower shadows lengthening. Just as they turned to leave, Sarah paused beside one of the crypts. Tarander's a lesser-known king whose reign had marked a time of slow decline. Her fingers brushed an engraving near the base, nearly invisible, a small crescent rune beneath the standard inscription. She knelt, brushing away centuries of grime. Beneath the dust lay an interlocking series of symbols, runes in the old tongue woven into a pattern of stars and lines. "It's a cipher," she breathed. Together they deciphered it, the words slow to emerge where stars are drowned. "The air shall sleep, seek the mouth that does not drink beneath the gaze of shattered crowns." Calamir frowned. "A riddle or a direction," Sarah said, excitement rising in her voice. "If we can understand it." But even as they stood pondering, a chill crept through the air. Too sudden, too sharp. Kelmer's hand went to his sword. From the far end of the crypt, a whisper stirred, not of wind, but of breath drawn through long dead lungs. A figure emerged, robed in rags, its face veiled in shadow. Not a white, not entirely. There was no hatred in it, no hunger, only sorrow. "You walk the halls of the sleeping," it said, in a voice like water on stone. "Why do you wake them?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "We seek Elinder. His tomb is gone." The figure tilted its head. "Not gone, removed, hidden for fear and for hope by whom?" The answer came slowly, as though spoken from a great depth by those who remembered what should not be known. Calamir's brow furrowed. What was it they feared? The figure's hand lifted, pointing not at them, but past them through the walls toward the distant lake beyond Fornos. Reached the memory of kings, the fire in the blood, the broken oath, and then it was gone, vanishing like smoke into the stone. They said nothing. For a long time at last, Sarah turned. "We have to go to Lake Evendim." Calamir nodded. "The mouth that does not drink a dry cave beneath the lake's gaze." Perhaps she rolled up the scroll, tucking it safely into her satchel. "But we're not alone anymore." Camer sheathed his sword. "We never were above." The last light of day slipped behind the hills, and night fell upon Furnos like a shroud. In the deep dark of the crypts, something stirred, not a ghost, not a white, but memory given shape and shadow the tomb of a lender was not lost it had been. Hidden for a reason, they departed for Nost at first light, though the sky gave little indication of dawn. A paw of mist clung to the land, thick and unmoving, as if the very air hesitated to breathe. Calamir rode with his cloak pulled tight, eyes fixed on the winding trail ahead. Sarah rode behind, the worn scrolls in her satchel rustling like whispers with each jolt of the horse's step. Neither spoke for a time. Silence had become their companion, an uninvited third rider whose presence grew heavier the nearer they drew to the heart of Arnor's forgotten. Land's Lake, even dim, lay 2 days north by horse, a still mirror nestled in a bowl of green hills and stony cliffs. It had once been the heart of the kingdom, the site of Anamenas, the first capital of the northern Dunedain. Now it was a realm of silence and reflection, where the bones of the city slept beneath the water's glassy skin. The lake was deep, deeper than the eye could judge, and in its calmest moments it was said that stars appeared in its depths long before they graced the sky above. The elves called it Ninual, the Lake of Twilight. The men of the north remembered it as sacred ground, though few remained who remembered it all. As they rode, Sarah spoke softly, more to herself than to Calamir. The riddle said, where stars are drowned, could it mean the lake itself, a tomb hidden beneath the water? Calamir did not answer at first. His thoughts were far off, clouded by memories he did not summon, and dreams that clung like cobwebs to the edge of waking. Stars don't drown in water, he said at last, unless they fall a place where the heavens are reflected, but not reached a place where the past lingers like a ghost. He turned in the saddle. We're not looking beneath the lake, we're looking beneath its gaze. Sarah met his eyes, frowning. The cliffs. He nodded. There's a shelf of stone on the northern side. My father once told me of caves. They're dry. Even when the lake swells, few go there. Now the paths are crumbling and the rock is treacherous. Her voice was almost a whisper then. That is where we must go by. The second dusk, the lake lay before them, a sheet of stillness bordered by ancient trees and the skeletal remains of a numinous, half swallowed by ivy and time. Columns once graced with silver inlay now leaned like weary sentinels there. Reflections shimmering in the water, a cold breeze swept across the lake, stirring only the surface as if reluctant to disturb the depths. Kalimi led the way around its edge, his horse stepping lightly over the stones, while Saruth trailed behind, her eyes scanning the cliffs above. As night fell, they made camp in the shadow of a broken tower, whose top had collapsed into the reeds. A fire flickered between them, muted and weary. The lake glistened nearby, black as polished obsidian reflecting a crescent moon and 1,000 unseen stars. Sarah unrolled the scroll again, poring over the cipher etched in the ancient tongue. She traced the lines with a fingertip, not reading so much as listening. At last, she looked up. The shattered crowns, do you suppose it refers to the statues? There were 9, once weren't there, kings of Arnor seated along the water's edge. Calamir nodded slowly, one for each generation before the kingdom split. I've seen the remains, only 2 still stand. Sarah leaned closer to the fire. Then we'll search there tomorrow. The gaze of the crowns may point us toward the hidden mouth, but neither of them slept easily that night. The lake whispered it Was not the wind, it was not the shifting of reeds or the cry of nightboards. It was deeper, subtler sigh from beneath the water, as if the stones themselves breathed in slow remembrance Calamir lay awake staring at. The stars reflected in the blackness, and thought again of the dream he had in the barrow downs the face pale and sorrowful, crowned not with gold, but with burden at the edge of sleep he heard. Another sound, the clink of stone, the hollow note of metal brushing metal, and a voice, a man's voice, faint and distant, shall return when all is ash, when fire remembers its name. Then silence again, deep and unbroken. He did not speak of it to Sarah. The next morning, though her eyes told him she had heard something as well, they climbed the cliffs at midday. The path was as treacherous as Calamir had said, crumbled in places, overgrown, in others the stones slick with moss and time. Sarah moved with the care of one not born to the wilds, but she was resolute, her grip steady even when the wind pulled at her cloak like unseen fingers halfway up. They paused beside the remains of the statues, enormous figures carved in the likeness of kings long dead, seated as though still watching over the lake. Most had fallen, their faces shattered, but two still stood, one headless, the other cracked down the middle as though split by lightning. Between them lay a hollow in the cliffside, so subtle it might have been nothing more than a shadow at noon, but in the evening light it became something else, a cliff in the rock, narrow and tall like the doorway to a forgotten hall. Calamir stepped forward first, drawing his lantern. Its light revealed a narrow corridor of stone descending steeply into the heart of the cliff. No markings, Zareth said, her voice hushed. No runes, no seal. It wasn't meant to be found, Calam replied. They entered. The descent was steep, the steps uneven, worn not by frequent passage, but by the slow erosion of water and time. The walls narrowed as they went, and the air grew colder, filled with a scent like old paper and damp stone. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel opened into a chamber round with a domed ceiling and a floor tiled in strophagus black as obsidian its lid. Untouched, there were no inscriptions, no sigils, only the stones smooth and perfect, as though carved not by chisel, but by will alone. TTH stepped forward, and as she did, her lantern caught something, a glint at the far wall. She turned. Embedded in the stone was a tablet no larger than a shield, carved in Elvish and sealed in wax. She read aloud, her voice trembling. Here lies a lender, last light of the west. Let none disturb his sleep-free dreams of a fire yet unkindled and a crown not yet claimed. When the stars fall into shadow and the line of kings is no more, then shall he rise, not in body, but in truth. They stared at the words, the echo of them lingering in the chamber. He was hidden, Sarah whispered, not to be protected, but to protect something else. Calamir moved to the tomb, running his hand along its smooth surface, a legacy buried until its time. Behind them the shadows shifted, not from lantern or movement, but with intent. The chamber was not empty. The air in the chamber thickened, not with dust or decay, but with something weightless and ancient, like the tension in a dream before the meaning becomes clear. Calamir stepped back from the tomb, his lantern casting long, trembling shadows against the curved walls behind him. Sarah stood still, her gaze caught not by fear, but by a deeper awareness, as Though a thread had been pulled in the fabric of time, and they now stood in the ripple of its unraveling, neither spoke. For speaking felt wrong in that place. It was not simply the tomb of a man, but the last breath of a forgotten promise sealed in silence and stone. And then from the dark edge of the chamber a figure emerged, not as a specter nor a beast from shadow, but a man tall, robed in gray, with a hood drawn low over his face. His steps made no sound. He bore no torch, no weapon, yet his presence changed the air, made it colder. More lucid, Calamir's hand reached for his sword, but something in him hesitated. This was no enemy of flesh. There was no threat in the figure's bearing, only sorrow, so heavy it seemed to hang from his shoulders like a mantle rod of iron and memory. The figure spoke, and his voice was like a low wind. Through winter branches calm, slow, and old you have come, far children of dust. You have found what was not meant to be found. Zareth stepped forward, eyes bright. With defiance and wonder we seek truth, not trespass. This tomb was hidden not to guard against time or war, but to bury a truth too dangerous to endure what was. Italender knew that the kings of Arnor chose to forget. The figure turned his hooded head toward her, though his face remained in shadow. The air seemed to shift, as if her words had stirred an unseen current. Italender, he said, and in that name there was not just reverence, but mourning was. The last to see the west clearly before the line faltered and split beneath the weight of pride. He knew that the legacy of Numer was a blade with two edges, one bright with wisdom, the other dark with wrath. He saw that to preserve the light, it must be hidden from men no longer had the strength to bear it. Kalami took a step forward, his voice low, careful. What? Like the hooded figure raised a hand, not in warning, but in memory. There was once an oath sworn by Isel, not the one that bound the dead man of Dunharrow, but a quieter one, spoken only to his son. It was a vow to guard a secret given to him at the fall of Numer, when the world bent and the seas drank. The pride of kings, he carried something with him from the wreckage, not a weapon, nor a jewel, but knowledge. A vision. Tarot's voice barely rose above a whisper, a prophecy. More than that, the figure replied, a glimpse into what must come after the fading of the west day. Future seen not through the eyes of elves or gods, but through the dream of men, their sorrow, their hope, their fire. Isildur passed it to Allender, and Allender, seeing what such knowledge might become, chose to bury it. He gave himself not only to death, but to silence. A long pause followed. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and lean inward, listening. The stars on the tiled floor glimmered faintly in the lantern light, as if echoing a sky. Long forgotten. Seraph looked toward the obsidian tomb, and for a moment she saw it differently, not as a prison for the dead, but a vault for the living, a cradle holding something fragile, waiting to wait. She turned to the figure, her tone steady. And now, why let us come, why let us see? The figure lowered his hood, revealing a face lined with age, though untouched by the wear of mortal years. His hair was silver as frost, his eyes deep gray. Neither elf nor man. His voice, when he spoke again, had softened, because the hour is near. The west has crumbled in his stories. The east stirs once more. The heirs of kings walk in rags. The fire is nearly out. Alender's truth may soon be needed, not to raise a king, but to remind the world That one once was Calamir's gaze locked with the old man's. Then, what do you ask of us, the old? Figure stepped aside, motioning toward the sealed tomb, not to open it, not yet, but to carry the memory of this place, to keep it secret and sacred there are. Those who would twist a lender's vision into fire and ruin, let his dream remain. A dream until the world is ready to remember it rightly. Seraph looked down, her hands trembling slightly over the scroll case at her side. Her whole life had been the pursuit of knowledge of. Light cast upon the shadows of history, and yet in that moment she understood. Something that no scroll could teach, that some truths are not torches to be held high, but embers to be carried quietly through the night. She gave a single nod. I will write nothing, she said, not yet, but I will. Remember, Calmia, ever a man of fewer words, gave a silent bow. The old figure stepped back into shadows, then go leave this place before its silence closes again. You have walked far into the memory of kings. Now return to the world of the waking. They climbed in silence back through the narrow tunnel, their lanterns flickering like the last gleam of starlight before the dawn. Outside, the lake remained still, its surface smooth. And knowing the statues of the broken kings stood as they had before, but now in the wind that stirred the grass at their feet, Calamir thought he heard something new, a faint voice, as if from a distant hall, saying, not farewell, but wait. When they reached their horses, the sun was rising beyond the hills, casting gold across the lake's surface. The shadows of the cliffs fell long behind them, sir. Mounted slowly the weight of what they had seen settling into her bones like winter. Calamir looked once more toward the hidden cleft, now invisible in daylight, as if it had never been. They did not speak of what they would tell others, or of how much to guard. That decision would come in time, for now they carried a memory between them, a secret not born of greed or fear, but of reverence. A lender still slept, and with him the fire he had dared to dream, and somewhere in the silence of the tomb the stars above him glowed, faintly waiting the road from Lake Evendim to the south. Wound like a river through the green silence of forgotten woods and weather-worn hills, passing through lands where no banners flew and no horns called the watch. Here the world had grown old and watchful, a place where stories whispered among trees rather than shouted from stone towers. Curly and Sarah rode in thoughtful silence, their horses weary, their minds more so. The knowledge they bore was weightless in form, yet heavy in consequence, a secret older than their own names, wrapped in prophecy, remembrance, and the quiet defiance of a prince who had chosen to be forgotten. They had left no mark behind. Noken was raised, no words carved into bark or stone. The chamber in the cliffside returned to its slumber as though no mortal had stirred within it. This was not a victory to be proclaimed, but a wound reopened, a glimpse into a truth that had been hidden because the world was not ready to carry it. The tomb of a lender was not merely a burial site. It was a decision etched in black stone, and silence to wait until the world could dream again without turning vision into tyranny. By the second night they camped beneath the broken boughs of a lightning-split tree, its twisted limbs reaching upward like a frozen cry. The stars above were clear and in different scattering, their ancient light, as if to remind them how small their discoveries truly were. But in Sarah's eyes there was a kindled fire, one not born of ambition, but of. She stared into the coals of their campfire for a long time before she spoke, and when she did her voice was low. And uncertain I wonder if we were meant to find it at all, she said, not looking up, or if we stumbled across something sacred by mistake. Calamir did not answer at once. He sat sharpening his blade by habit, though there was no enemy near, no threat on the wind. His eyes were on the stars. But his thoughts were beneath the stone in the silence of that chamber. Sometimes the world chooses its messengers poorly, he said at last, but perhaps that is the point. Great truths often come not to kings or heralds, but to those quiet enough to listen. Sarah smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of her satchel where the scroll lay wrapped in oilskin and memory. I've spent half my life looking for what I found in that cave, and now that I've seen it, I don't know what to do with it. Then hold it, Calamir said, his voice steady. That is enough. Hold it, guard it, remember it when the time comes. You know, she turned to him, eyes sharp through the shadows. And if I don't, he met her gaze with calm certainty. Then I will. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of trust, unspoken and profound, binding them with something deeper than oath or command, a quiet companionship forged not by shared past, but by the future they might one day choose to protect as the fire burned low. They slept in turns, each watching while the other dreamed, each wondering whether Morpheus himself drifted in their sleep, stirring old visions like silt from the depths of time. The next day they crossed the Greenway, once the proud road of commerce and royal passage, now overgrown and broken, its stones jostled by roots and half swallowed by the earth. Few traveled these paths any more, save for scattered rangers and the occasional merchant mad enough to test the wilds. They stopped briefly in Andrith, a wind-scoured hill between the Barrow Downs and Bree, where a Loneway house still offered shelter. There they found food, water, and news. The South was restless, and rumor ran like wildfire through the smaller towns. Murmurs of black ships in the east, strange lights seen beyond the misty mountains, and whispers that a shadow was growing slowly, imperceptibly, but with intent. Calamir listened with the quiet attention of one trained to hear more than was said. Sarah scribbled in her journal by habit, but even she seemed subdued, the recent weight of discovery shadowing her usual hunger for detail. That night, as they sat near the hearth in the common room of the Way House, a wandering peddler shared a tale he claimed had come from Gundor, a rumor that the white tree had withered in a recent storm, and that the steward had taken it as an omen of endings. Of course, the man added with a grin, missing 3 teeth, trees do die and omens blow, whichever way the winds feel in. But Calamir did not smile, nor did Sarah. Later, when the fire had burned low and the peddler snored into his tankard, she leaned close and whispered, what if Elender's dream was never about one king or one time, but something older, a memory from Numer that was never meant to reach our age? Calamir's answer was quiet and steady, like the voice of a watchman facing the dark. Then it survived for a reason. They left at dawn, following the road east toward the Weather Hills, where the ruins of a Monsel still watched from the high crags like a sentinel. Turned to stone from there, they would part ways. Sarah too, Gundor to vanish into her library and guard the memory in silence. Calamir too, the wilds to keep watch on roads and rivers, listening for the tremble in the world that might signal the time had. Come as they neared Weathertop, the sky changed, clouds gathered low and heavy. Not with storm, but with silence, the hill itself loomed above them, its crown. Ringed with ancient stone, a monument to long-dead vigilance, they climbed together one. Final time, reaching the summit by midday there, with the wind whipping their cloaks and the land spread wide before them. They paused. Sarah turned her hair, caught in the wind like fire in flight. Do you believe the dream will come true? Commute looked out across the north, the wild, broken realm of Arnor, sleeping beneath the years. His eyes were calm, but in them burned something old. I believe that dreams do not die, he said. They wait. She nodded once, then held out her hand. Then may we both wake in time too. Remember it. He clasped her wrist in farewell, a ranger's gesture, not a courtly one. Then she turned and rode south, the wind at her back, the scroll hidden deep in her pack, and the memory of the tomb deeper still in her heart. Calamir remained on the hill until sunset, watching the light bend across the land, casting long shadows like the fingers of kings reaching from the past. When the stars emerged, mirrored faintly on the horizon, he bowed his head, not in reverence, but in recognition. A lender still slept, but the world was beginning to stir. The years that followed moved with the slow, deliberate pace of mountain rivers, sometimes gentle, sometimes swelling, but always in one direction, ever onward. The tale of a lender's hidden tomb faded from the world's noise, swallowed once again by the hush of ancient places. No new rumors surfaced, no wildeed wanderers came whispering of black tablets or forgotten kings. The few who might have searched found nothing, for the passage beneath the cliffs had disappeared beneath a rock fall that looked natural, as though the land itself had chosen to seal the secret. Once more only two remembered where the dream was buried, seraph in the vaulted shadows of Gundor's libraries, and Calamir in the open wild, walking the untamed paths of a kingdom that no longer wore a crown. Telemir became more ghost than man. To the folk of the north they spoke of him in hushed tones. When they spoke of him at all, a tall figure in a gray cloak appearing like breath on a cold window. Pain vanishing without sound, he left no trail, yet danger fled before his coming. Wolves avoided the hamlets he passed through. Strange footprints in the snow that had troubled herders would vanish. After his visits, children in Bree began to say that he could hear the trees speak and that the ravens brought him messages, though no one ever saw him talk to birds. Only the rangers knew the truth, that Calamir had taken upon himself a watch deeper than the bounds of his duty. He listened not only for the cries of encroaching evil, but for the tremble of forgotten things stirring in their sleep. Meanwhile, in Minister Tyrth, beneath the looming shadow of Mendaluin and the ever pale light of the white tree, Sarah lived like a whisper among scrolls. Her name never reached the councils of the steward, and she did not seek the ear of nobles. She was a scribe among scribes, one of dozens who copied fading records, mended broken spines, and preserved the crumbling thoughts of long-dead kings, yet none could match her memory. She walked the halls of the Hall of Kings with a quiet intensity, her steps soft but sure, as though she navigated not marble and dust, but the narrow corridors of time itself. Beneath her robes, hidden in a satchel stitched with ancient runes, the sealed copy of a lender's prophecy lay untouched, she had not opened it since. Returning from the lake, she dared not the words still lived inside her, perfectly remembered as though carved into her breath, and though she wrote many things in the long, quiet years. Translations of elven songs, genealogies of forgotten lords, even a treatise on numbermanry and architecture, she never wrote a single line of what she had seen beneath the shattered crowns, but she waited the signs when they came or not. Loud the world does not always announce the turning of its great wheels. Sometimes it is the wind that changes. First, or the silence in a place that once buzzed with life, sometimes it is. The sudden absence of bird song, or the way fires burn lower though the wood is. Dry Seraph began to notice these signs, not in reports or scrolls, but in the way. The scribes around her grew anxious without knowing why and how the white trees' leaves trembled even when there was no breeze. Travelers from the east began to speak of darkening skies and rivers that ran cold even in summer, and always there were dreams people spoke of. Them reluctantly half-remembered visions of a city beneath the waves, or a crown lying in ash, or a voice that called their name in a language they did not know. Some laughed them off, others prayed. More often Sarah said nothing but at night. She lay with her hand over her satchel and wondered if the time had come. Far to the north, Calamir too felt the shifting of the world, not in dreams, but in the rhythm of the land itself. Animals fled earlier than they used to, and strange tracks appeared near the ruins of ruder shapes, too large, too heavy for man or beast in the hills west. Of Fernast he found a standing stone he had marked with his own hand, shattered into dust, though no storm had passed one. Night beneath the broken tower, where he had once watched the stars, he awoke to find the wind whispering a single name, Elinder, though no one stood nearby. He knew then the waiting was over. They did not need to send word to one another. That was not the bond they shared. It was deeper than message or signal, a tether woven of memory, duty, and the quiet promise made between kindred spirits who had touched a truth larger than themselves. Sarah packed her satchel and descended from the tower of records with no farewell. Calamir turned south toward the lake, his steps silent as always, but now urgent. The land greeted their return like a breath held too long. The cliffs of Ninual rose pale and weathered above the mirrored waters, and though many years had passed, the hidden way revealed itself again, not by accident or chance, but as if summoned by the right convergence of wind time. And will the rock fall that had buried the entrance had shifted where once the mouth of stone had vanished, now it yawned again. Darker than memory, waiting, they arrived within hours of one another, and when their eyes met, there was no need for words. Sarah reached into her satchel and drew forth the scroll, still sealed its wax unbroken. Calamir nodded once, then turned to the dark. Together they stepped into the passage, lanterns casting twin flames against the stone. The descent was unchanged, steep, cold, carved by forgotten hands, but the air was different. It was no longer empty. It carried breath, purpose, something not quite awake, but stirring in the chamber. Below the tomb still stood black and silent, but the air thrummed around it as though the stone itself hummed with some unspoken music. Sarah approached the tablet on the far wall and raised the scroll. I kept it safe, she whispered, and placed it gently at its base. But now the world must choose. Calamine knelt beside the tomb. His fingers touched the smooth surface once more, and this time he felt warmth, not of fire, but of breath. Something within was listening the stars. On the mosaic floor began to glow. The chamber pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. In stone, and Elender, though still silent, no longer slept alone. The chamber now longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the hollow before a storm, a stillness that was not emptiness, but a poised breath, the pause before a world draws in upon itself, knowing that something vast and irreversible is about to unfold. The light of their lanterns, once dominant in the darkness, now flickered against the faint glow that rose from the floor itself, as though the stars and the mosaic tiles were catching echoes of some celestial fire reawakening from beneath. There was no sound, no movement, yet the entire space seemed to listen. It was not just stone and silence. It was aware. Calamir rose from his kneel, his fingers lingering a moment longer on the obsidian surface of the tomb, though it had not moved, though no lid had shifted, and no voice had risen from within. Something within him had changed. He felt the weight of his own blood more keenly now, as if the memory of his ancestors stirred in his veins like a tide turning. Elendil, the last true light of the North Kingdom, had not returned in body, but his spirit, his intent, had awakened, and in that awakening it reached out not as a ghost yearning for the past, but as a fire that sought to shape the future. Sarah stood motionless, the scroll still pressed to her chest. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the stunned clarity that overtakes those who realize they have passed the threshold between legend and truth. All her years spent among dusty tomes and forgotten runes had not prepared her for this moment. Knowledge had been her compass, her sanctuary, but this was not knowledge. This was revelation. This was the moment. The dream steps forward and asks to be believed, and something within her, some quiet, unshakable certainty, believe. They did not speak. There was nothing to be said that would not shrink the moment with language, but slowly Sarah moved forward and laid the sealed scroll upon the tomb. The wax, unbroken for years, shimmered in the faint light. She did not open it. That choice was not hers to make it belong to the world outside, to the coming hour, to the people who would one day need what the dream contained. Then something unseen shifted. It was not physical. No tremor moved the ground. No stone cracked or fell, but the air thickened, deepened, as if the chamber had inhaled. The lantern flames did not flicker, yet the shadows danced more wildly now, cast by a source of light not of this world. The stars in the floor grew brighter, their mosaic edges fading as their glow became real, not merely reflected. And then from the stone itself a sound emerged. It was not a voice in the usual sense. It had no words, no tone. It was a feeling shaped into sound, a memory with rhythm. It began as a low hum, barely audible, but rich with layers, like wind through the buffles of an ancient forest, or a distant choir singing in a hall too vast to ever echo. It resonated in the bones and the breath, in the spaces between thought. It was sorrow and promise and silence breaking. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks and could not say when they had begun to fall. Calamir bowed his head, not in worship, but in recognition. This was not the voice of Elender alone. It was the voice of all who had come before him. Ophir burdened with a cursed ring and the memory of a drowned island of Valendil, who ruled without a throne of Arvidi, who died in ice rather than yield a false crown. It was the voice of a lineage buried by time and shadow, yet never extinguished, and now it spoke not with command, but with a single intent. Remember, and just as it began, the sound faded, curling into silence like the final echo of a bell. The stars dimmed again, though not completely. They retained a faint glow, as if keeping watch. The air stilled the chamber, returned to its hushed slumber, but the hush had changed. It was no longer the sleep of things forgotten. It was the stillness of something waiting. Sarah turned to Calamir, at last, her voice with emotion. "What do we do now?" He looked at her, and, though his face bore no expression of triumph, it carried a kind of quiet peace. "We guard the dream," he said, "until the world can carry it." She nodded slowly, and her eyes drifted to the scroll, still unopened, still untouched. A part of her longed to break the seal, to know what a lender had seen, what had driven him to hide, even in death. But deeper still, she understood that it was not her time. The dream was not meant to be wielded. It was meant to be preserved. The words within were not weapons or answers. They were seeds. They left the chamber together, not hurriedly, but with a kind of reverent reluctance, as one does when leaving a place where something sacred has stirred. The path out of the cliffside felt different now, as if the stone itself recognized them. The air grew warmer with each step, and when they emerged into the fading light of day, the lake shimmered with a strange stillness. No ripple marred its surface, no bird called from the trees. It was as if the world had paused to listen to what had just passed below. They did not return to the tower. They did not raise signs or send messages. Instead, they made their way separately, as they had always been meant to do. As of a greater watch, Calamir turned east toward the rising sun and the lands where old shadows might soon stir again. Sarah rode west, back to the records she would continue to transcribe, with calm hands and quiet eyes hiding within them fragments of truth for those wise enough to see. Neither would speak of the tomb, nor of the song that rose from stone. They would wait, and in the deep chamber beneath the cliff, lit only by the glow of star-stones, in memory the tomb of Elender slept. Yet it was not sleep as mortals know. It was the sleep of legends, the kind that do not end, but change form, taking root in hearts, and bloodlines waiting for the hour when they will be needed most. The seal remained unbroken, the scroll untouched, but the silence within had shifted. The dream was awake. Time passed, though how much was difficult to measure. In the silent margins of legend, seasons came and went, unnoticed by those who were watching for subtler signs. Leaves fell and rivers swelled, and the long dusk of the third age pressed down like a held breath across the scattered lands of the north. Travelers spoke of unease in the forests and strange sounds in the hills, though none could name the source. The world was not yet burning, but something had shifted beneath its skin, like a slow cracking in the bones of the earth. And though no horn sounded and no black banners flew, the wise began to glance toward the east with narrowed eyes, sensing the rising of a tide long held back by memory and vigilance. In the south gun doors, walls still stood tall, But beneath the stone was worry the white tree had bloomed again, but its flowers were fewer now, and some whispered that they smelled less sweet than they once had. The steward's voice remained steady, but the eyes behind it seemed troubled. The world was not as it had been. Old allies had grown quiet old. Roads had grown strange. Even the sky seemed to have lost its clarity, as if veiled by the breath of something vast. And waiting, yet the people went about their lives. The bakers still baked, the soldiers still marched, but those who listened, truly listened, began to hear. The change in the wind, Sir continued her quiet work in the archives beneath the citadel, unnoticed by most, respected by few. She wrote diligently, transcribing tales and restoring damaged texts, but her true work lay elsewhere beneath the surface of her records in the interwoven threads of annotations and footnotes. She was fragments of the dream, not plainly, never fully, but enough that one day someone, searching in earnest, might follow the trail of echo and riddle and find themselves standing at the edge of that secret place, as she once had. She spoke to no one of the scroll she had carried, and returned. Its seal remained unbroken, hidden within a stone box buried beneath her floor, guarded by little more than silence and hope. Yet she watched the signs when news came of dark things stirring in the east, when rumors of lost kings and forgotten oaths began to swirl like mist through the alleys of Menist. She listened closely. In the north, Calamir walked the fading lands. Like a shadow given form, his hair was touched with gray, now not from age, but from long exposure to the cold breath of untended things. He passed unseen through valleys and ruins, through forests that whispered in languages older than leaves. He watched, he remembered, when strangers came north bearing golden coins, and too many questions. He followed them until they turned back, unnerved by the silence of the barrows or the unnatural chill near the lake, when creatures with eyes too bright for wolves and hands too thin for orcs moved through the hills near Candom. He marked them, made their paths known to those who still kept along watch. He was one man, but he was not alone, for even among the scattered remnants of Arnor, there were still those who remembered. Not many, not enough to form armies or raise towers, but enough to keep the flame alive. They met rarely and never in the same place. Twice they spoke in symbols, not names, but they knew. They carried the weight of a lender's silence in their bones, even if they did not know its source. And when Calmir came among them, he brought not commands, but clarity. He reminded them that history was not over, that the dream had not been lost, only hidden, and that the time might soon come when it would need to be born again. One such gathering took place beneath the eaves of the troll shores, where the trees grew thick and twisted, and the stones bore scars older than men. There, beside a fire whose light never reached more than a few feet from its source, Calamir stood among a Halfosen. Others, rangers, wanderers, and watchers, men and women who had abandoned comfort. For purpose he did not tell them of the tomb, that truth still slept, but he told them of the signs, the shifting winds, the murmured dreams that came to children and madmen alike, the strange symbols found carved into rocks that no hand had touched in 100 years. He told them of a world beginning to stir, as though it too had heard the echo of the chamber beneath the lake. The east gathers one of the men, said a scarred veteran with a voice like worn leather, but the south is Not ready Gundor has grown too proud, then we must not rely on Gundor Calamir. Answered quietly, we must rely on the dream. And though none of them fully understood what he meant, they nodded, for dreams had power, even in silence, especially in silence. Far away in a narrow tower overlooking the sea, an old elf stirred. In his sleep curtained the shipwright who had not dreamed in many long years opened his eyes to the salt wind and the hush of the tide, and felt something move within. The deep places of the world, he did not speak of it, to the others not. But he walked the docks that night alone beneath the stars, and looked eastward, not across the ocean but back, toward the fading lands of men, and deep beneath the cliffs of Lake Evendy, where the stars glowed faintly in their mosaic prison. The tomb remained sealed, the scroll remained unopened, but the silence within was not still. The air moved slowly with the pulse of something not breathing, but becoming. The chamber did not wait in death, it waited in labor, holding within it the dream of a king who would not return in flesh, but in truth. A crown not worn, but remembered, a fire not wielded, but past not all. Sleeping kings rise, some remain, as symbols sharper than any sword, more enduring than any fortress, and the greatest among them are not those whose names are shouted from tower to tower, but those whose memory becomes a question whispered across ages. What if they had not fallen? What if they still watch? What if we are not alone? The world was not yet ready to answer, but it was beginning to ask. There comes a moment in every age not marked by trumpet or flame, not inscribed in any ledger or scroll, when the old fabric of the world begins to tear in. Silence, a single thread snagged by time, or chance, or fate, begins to pull, unraveling the tapestry of the known. It is never visible to those who dwell in the comfort of the day's routines, whose lives are wrapped in trade, law, harvest, and hearth. But those who dwell at the edges, who walk the wild borders between light and shadow, feel, if first, the change in the earth's breath, the tension in the trees, the silence before the word is spoken, and in that silence dreams begin to move, not the dreams of sleep, but the ones buried deep within blood and lineage, passed like whispers through generations that no longer remember their listening. It was in such a moment, imperceptible to most, that the world shifted once more. The darkness in the east began to gather, not as armies yet, but as rumor and omen. Strange beasts were seen in the borderlands, creatures that bore no name in the tongues of men, or elves with eyes that flickered like coals, and limbs that moved as though jointed by malice. Travelers vanished along the ancient roads, and villages that once clung stubbornly to ruin were found emptied, their fires still warm there, doors left open, as if the people had simply stepped away mid-breath. Even the animals knew deer fled to higher ground. Without reason, birds circled and vanished from forests that once echoed with their songs. And in the heart of all this, the unease grew not as a terror, but as a question. What was rising? What had been sleeping, not in caves or tombs, but in the bones of the world itself? In Min Tith Sereth walked the white halls of the archive with a subtle urgency in her step. Her face had not aged much, though the lines at the corners of her mouth had deepened, not with worry, but with silence. Too long kept she spent her days transcribing, still diligent in her work, but her nights had grown different. She no longer wrote with the quiet hand of a scholar, but with the trembling purpose of a messenger unsure of her audience, her hidden texts once layered with riddles and inference had become clearer, still veiled, still cautious, but sharper. She was no longer simply preserving knowledge, she was preparing it her. Dreams had returned at first, they had been soft things, flickers of light. Beneath water, a voice calling her name through snow, but now they came stronger. Clearer she saw the lake again, its surface undisturbed, but lit from below she saw the tomb, its lid glistening with frost and memory, and each time the stars in. The mosaic burned a little brighter. Once she dreamed of Alinder himself, not as a corpse nor a spirit, but as a figure of light and ash standing beneath a broken sky, holding in his hand not a sword but a crown of fire. He did not speak, he only looked at her, and in that gaze she felt the weight of every unspoken vow. She awoke with a name on her lips, a name she did not understand but could not forget. Then Doral, she searched the archives, the ancient glossaries, the broken parchments of second-hand Elvish. The word did not exist, but something in her stirred at its sound. It was not a name meant for speech, it was meant for remembering. South of Bree, in the wildlands where the trees thickened and the stars grew, shy Calamir stood at the edge of a wide glen, watching a small band of dark-robed figures moving through the trees. They were silent, swift, and too practiced for common travelers. He followed them from a distance, his steps quiet as breath, his cloak blending with the earth. The group made no fire, no camp. They moved like pilgrims with no need of rest, but their path was wrong. It pointed not toward any known shrine or ruin, but curved slowly toward the Barrow Downs, and beyond them toward Lake Eandim. Calamir's hand gripped the hilt of his blade. These were not mere seekers, they were searching for something they did not yet understand, driven by a rumor that should not have escaped the silence. He followed them for 3 days and 3 nights until they passed into the cold mist that forever clung to the hills near the lake. Then, when the moment came, he moved swift, certain. When he returned to the hills alone, there were no more footsteps on the path, but he was no longer calm. Someone somewhere had heard what should never have been spoken. The silence was cracking on the 4th night. As he watched the lake from the cliff's edge, a wind rose, not strong, not cold, but strange, as though it carried the scent of another time. It blew gently across the water, and Calamir felt for the first time in many years a tremor pass through the land, not from beneath, but from within, as if the very heart of the north had stirred in its sleep. He did not enter the tomb, that was not his purpose, but he stood at the hidden entrance and placed his hand against the stone, closing his eyes. Beneath his fingers the rock felt warm, not with heat, but with presence, as if something on the other side had placed its hand there, mirroring his gesture. He whispered only one word: wait. Far across the world, in the high chambers of Reindl, Elrond sat before a window open to the night. Though years pressed heavily upon him, his gaze remained clear. The wind that touched his cheek bore no scent, but it made him shiver nonetheless. He turned to his desk, opened a book written in the elder script of Numer, and began to read, not from the beginning, but from the middle, where the story broke and began again, and in the deep places of the world, beneath cliffs and memory, beneath silence and stone. The tomb of Alinder waited. The scroll still lay at its base. Unbroken, untouched, but no longer alone around it the stars glowed steadily not. Bright not faint, but awake the chamber did not breathe, but it pulsed faint and rhythmic like the heartbeat of something long preparing to be born and above in. The world of men the hour approached, not the end, not yet, but the moment before. The end begins. The first true sign of change did not come with fire or blood, but with silence, a silence so deep and sudden it seemed to fall across the land. Like a veil, muting bird, song stilling wind, and swallowing even the distant. Murmur of rivers that had flowed for ages untold, it settled first upon the north the old. Bones of Arnor, where ancient cities lay scattered like shattered runes across a sleeping land's farmers stopped in there fields and looked skyward without knowing why children ceased their games. Struck dumb by a sense of presence pressing down upon their breath, even the animals' stilled ears pricked not with fear, but with reverence. The land itself was listening as though a voice long forgotten had spoken again, not aloud, but deep beneath where memory mingles with stone and gun door. The white city glimmered still in the sun tall and pale against the mountainside, but something had changed in its rhythm. Riders returned from the borders with strange reports, not of battles, but of absences. Villages found empty, paths gone, cold signs of movement with no destination. The steward listened in quiet unease. His counselors debated the usual causes. Bandits, early winter discontent, but beneath their words ran a current of something else, a feeling that the world had turned its face slightly, and the light that once fell upon them now bent. Elsewhere, even in the high halls of Minas, where light once pulled like water, the shadows had begun to deepen at the corners, and Sarah quiet who walked the libraries as though she belonged to the stone itself, felt it most of all. Her dreams once missed and whisper had grown clear, cruelly clear with each passing night. The tomb no longer stood in silence in her visions. She walked its mosaic floor, bare feet echoing against the domed ceiling, and each time she drew near the obsidian sarcophagus, she heard sound. Like breath through flame the scroll at its base no longer waited passively. It pulsed faintly in her dreams, the wax seal glowing with some inner light, as though it sought her hands to open it. But she would not yet, for she had come to understand something terrible and beautiful. The dream of Allender was not a message, it was a summons. She had spent years planting the dream fragment by fragment into the veins of Gundor's record, a phrase here, a footnote there, a mention of the fire of the forgotten crown, a reference to the ninth star unburied. These seeds have been scattered, carefully hidden beneath layers of myth and misdirection. Now, without her bidding, she saw them begin to grow. Young scribes began to ask questions they never had before. A newly appointed archivist brought her a text she had buried deep in the private recesses of the law vaults, unaware of its origin. It called to me, he had said with a sheepish smile. I don't know why. Sarah had nodded and said nothing, but inside a chill spread across her ribs like frost. And far to the north Calamir walked the old roads again, not in watchfulness now, but in preparation. He no longer wandered. He moved with purpose, circling the forgotten barrows, tracing the ruins of Anumenius, touching stones long worn, smoothed by rain and regret. he was awakening the land in his way speaking, to it not with words, but with presence reminding it of what had been buried not in tombs, but in soil and silence. The old places responded, the wind shifted, the birds changed their flight. A fox followed him for 3 days without reason, and one night beneath the broken eye of Weathertop he sang a song no longer sung by men, a song in the old tongue taught to him by a ranger who had learned it from another, who had learned it from one who claimed to have heard it. In a dream, it was a lament for a king who had never been crowned, and as he sang, the stars above him grew brighter. And the wind did not blow. He returned to the lake without hesitation, the path to the tomb opened for him, as if it had never been sealed. The stone at the entrance felt warm beneath his palm. He descended without lantern, for the stars within had begun to shine again, their light pale but sure. When he entered the chamber, he found the scroll still at the base of the tomb, but it was no longer dormant. It trembled faintly as if stirred by breath. Koluz did not touch it. He merely knelt and placed a single object beside it, a ring of plain silver, unmarked save for a single star etched within the band. He had worn it for years, not as a token of rank, but as a quiet reminder. Now he left it as a sign. I remember, he whispered, and I wait above ground. The wind began to rise, but it was not a storm that came. It was a whisper, grown vast, a whisper that reached across forests, over mountain ranges, into hearts and dreams. Those who had blood touched by Numer felt it first, not as a sound, but as a deep stirring, a call older than their names. A boy in Dalamroth woke from sleep and wept, not knowing why. A captain on the Anduin dreamt of a tree that burned with no flame. A woman in the blue mountains saw a star fall from the sky and vanish into the earth. All across the lands, small signs gathered like kindling, and in Reendel, where twilight lingered longer than elsewhere, Eland at last closed his book and stood. He walked to a balcony facing west, but his eyes turned north. He did not speak, he did not summon counsel. He merely placed his hand on the stone rail and let the silence carry his thought. He had felt it, the song beneath the earth, the shift in the echo of time. The old line long buried had stirred, not in blood, not yet, but in spirit, in memory, and that he knew was the beginning of every great change. Somewhere beneath the cliffs of Evendy, the tomb of a lender pulsed with a breathless anticipation. The stars on the floor shone steady now, as if marking the hours not by sun or moon, but by the gathering of fate. The scroll sat at the tomb's foot, its wax no longer inert, but swelling gently, as though something within it pushed outward, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The sarcophagus did not open. There was no flash of divine intervention, but within the walls of that forgotten sanctuary, the dream was no longer waiting. It was preparing. It was not thunder that heralded the change, nor fire from the sky, nor the cry of eagles sweeping low across the peaks. It was quiet, so quiet it passed beneath the notice of those too accustomed to waiting for grand signs. But in the stillness, something ancient unfolded, not with noise, but with weight, the weight of meaning, of time, remembered, of stories long untold, beginning at last to lift their heads like sleepers stirring. After long centuries in the dark, the world did not break open. It turned slowly with the reluctant grace of old doors groaning on forgotten hinges, revealing a corridor Once thought sealed forever in the chamber beneath the cliffs of Lake, Evendy the tomb of Allender, no longer. Simply slept it, listened the stars carved into the floor had brightened too. A pale, unwavering glow, casting silver light across the curved walls and the smooth obsidian sarcophagus. The air within thrummed faintly, not with sound, but with presence. Like the moment before a note is sung, or before a hand touches water in perfect stillness. The scroll at the foot of the tomb pulsed gently in the gloom, and with it the seal, that simple disk of wax. Cracked, it did not shatter, it did not explode, it simply broke a thin line, splitting its center like a breath drawn after lifetimes of silence. There was no hand to break it, no voice commanding it. The act was not one of violence, but of timing, as if the seal had waited of its own volition until the world was ready. The scroll unfurled, just a fraction, page parting with a sound of leaves, stirring under moonlight. The air seemed to lean, in the chamber held its breath. And in that moment memory became prophecy. Far away Sarah stood before the citadel of Minister Tth. Her eyes lifted not to the mountain behind it, nor to the white tree trembling gently in the courtyard, but to the wind itself, which now carried the taste of ash and stars. She felt the shift before she understood it. Something had changed in the fabric of things, not visible, not loud, but profound in her chambers below. The library, the stone box that held the second scroll, trembled slightly, a fine crack threading across its lid like frost on glass. She rushed to it, falling to her knees. The box was warm. She did not open it. She did not need the twin. To that message had already moved. The story had begun to unfold, and no hand, not even hers, could now prevent it from running its course. The dream had passed from thought to motion. Kim, standing on the cliff above the lake, saw the reflection of something not visible in the sky, a shimmer in the water like starlight, sinking into shadow. He knew without question that the seal had broken. He did not descend. He did not disturb the tomb. His role was not to read the message, but to ensure it would endure long enough for the right eyes to see it. And so he remained the last ranger at the edge of a world about to remember what it had once dared to believe elsewhere. Those who had touched fragments of the dream felt the tremor. Ministers in D. Amroth, who found themselves gazing northward without cause. Dwarves deep in the blue mountains, pausing mid-forge, as if struck by a memory not their own. And an old woman in Rohan, who awoke weeping, unable to explain the vision of a crown made not of gold but flame and sea foam and grief. Across the world the message traveled, not as a voice, but as recognition, as if something buried in the heart of each listener had finally heard its own name whispered from beneath the skin of the world. And in the tomb the scroll unfurled completely. It bore no sigil, no map, no proclamation of war. It was a single page written in the flowing script of the Númenórean kings, preserved by craft and grace beyond mortal reckoning. The words were not long, but they burned with clarity, as though every line had been forged in fire and cooled in shadow. If you read this, then the world has turned beyond its reckoning. I am a Linder son of Aldor, last prince of the north. I saw the end before it came, not in dream, but in truth. The line of kings would falter, the flame would dwindle, and men would forget, but no. This the fire is not gone, it sleeps in stone and memory in the hearts of those who wait. Do not look for my body, I am not returning in flesh, but the crown I bore was never meant for my brow alone, it was a light passed through time to be. Kindled again, not by command, but by choice, let no one claim it whose words, though spoken by no living voice, began to echo through the hollows of the world, picked up in stories and songs and sudden tears and unexplained. Courage in new age had not begun, but something deeper had the mystery of the tombs of Arnor once lost beneath, dust buried beneath. Forgetfulness was no longer a riddle, it was a key, and though Allender would never walk the world again, his presence had returned not as a man, but as a memory, sharp enough to guide the hand of the living. In the end, there was no crown raised, no army summoned, no temple built, there was only a scroll and a silence, filled now with meaning and a dream no longer waiting but walking.